Okay. So when we're trying to motivate employees, remember the ultimate goal is to motivate your employee to not shirk, right? We want to make it so that your employee works as hard as they can, or at least as hard as they're hired to work. More accurately, right? We want them to work. Uh, we want them to not shirk, right? To put it simply, we want them to do their job. Okay, and so there are sort of two obvious forms of motivating employees, right? So the goal again is to motivate employees. Right? This is what we're trying to do, and there's sort of two ways to do that. The first one is a pretty obvious one. We want to pay them, okay? And as we've discussed throughout the semester, is that when you pay people to do something, generally speaking, they're going to do it, right? The second way, which we haven't discussed, but I'm willing to bet that you can guess, is to threaten to fire them. Okay? The greater the threat of being fired is, the harder the worker will generally work in order to avoid being fired. Right? Now we should note or mention here that the threat of firing an employee only works to an extent, right? If you make the threat clear, right, and the employees, if you make the threat clear, the employees will probably all quit and go work somewhere else if they have alternative employment options, right? So threatening to fire someone really only produces modest results at best and only works if the worker has no real relevant alternative, right? Now, in situations where the workers do not have many options at all, and it's especially easy for the employer to replace that worker, firing works extremely well, right? Remember that replacing a worker is only costly if you actually have to do it, right? So the only time you incur the cost of replacing a worker is if you actually fire that worker, right? It doesn't cost you anything if you can sufficiently threaten an employee into working hard enough to not need to be fired. Okay? And so, in situations where workers have very few options, what we see employers do is just threaten to fire them, right? Mining towns that primarily only have the mine to work at, right? They will typically use threats to fire, right? If it's the case that the mine is the only real good place of employment. Now, this is it's a very big assumption, okay? So it doesn't happen much, right? But we do see it in military towns, right? So we see threatening to fire you, which if you work for the military or on base, I should say, threatening to fire you could encompass threatening to court martial you or anything like that. So the military tends to have a high threat of firing, right? At least from my reading. So those of you, if you've been in the military and you know something more on this, please let me know. I will gladly defer to your knowledge on this. Okay, but you know, in this thing, we've said you can pay them, right? And as we've discussed, there's lots of different ways I can pay you. I can pay you in healthcare benefits. I can pay you in cars, cell phones, and all kinds of stuff like that, right? But we can also pay them in money. So let's pretend we're only giving them money. There's still different ways that I can pay people, right? So I can pay you based on commission, right? So I can pay you based on commission, or I can pay you a salary, right? Which could be annual, as we typically think of it, or it could even be hourly, right? We can think of your hourly wage as an hourly salary, right? And each one of these, working by commission or for a salary, will entail sort of different outcomes, right? If we pay people based on commission, right, then what do they want to do? So if they're paid on commission, right, they'll want to maximize sales, right? Okay, but what might happen in their quest to maximize sales or output, right, is that we could see, and this sounds like a great idea, right? If we want to incentivize the employees to, do the most work, right? It might make sense to pay them based on how much work they actually get done, right? That makes sense. But this increased output, right, may come at the cost of decreased quality, right? As employees end up spending their whole day trying to maximize the number of things that get done rather than the amount of quality things that get done, right? And so imagine that you're being paid based on, let's say you're building, furniture, right? And I tell you that I will pay you $20 for every single chair that you successfully build, right? Well, you're probably going to want to, and I don't give you any specifications about what constitutes a chair, right? And what sort of quality standards must be met, et cetera, right? In that world, what are you going to do? Are you going to spend all day building me one very nice chair? Or are you going to spend all day trying to build as many chairs as you possibly can and not worry about the quality, right? Well, I submit to you that most people, maybe you're the honest, Abe or whatever, most people are probably going to try to maximize the number of chairs they build so that they can maximize the number of dollars that they earn. Okay? And so it's not exactly the case that maximizing sales or paying people by commission is always and everywhere the best plan. But at the same time, so maybe a salary is best, right? Maybe salaries are the way to go, right? But here, right, what do people do in here? Well, they're going to want to minimize the amount of actual work. That they do, all right? If I tell you that I'm going to pay you $8 an hour, regardless of the number of units that you produce, right? Well, what's your incentive to work hard and try to make as many as you possibly can, right? Your incentive is very small, right? You're basically only going to work as hard as it takes to not get fired, right? And so that might be a potential problem, okay? And so while there's broadly speaking sort of two ways to pay people, either by commission or some form of a salary, right? And obviously we can go between these things. There's a whole range of things between where I pay, 40 grand a year plus 10% of your sales or whatever, right? We can think of all kinds of different, combinations of these things, okay? And so there's lots of different ways to pay people, and each one sort of creates a different incentive structure that may or may not be best given the needs and unique characteristics of the business. Now we can think of the relationship between employers and employees as being a sort of contract between them, right? The employee is hired to help advance the goals and objectives of the employer, and in return receives wages or other benefits, right? Now often there are understandings and implied promises that if employees work hard and perform well, then they'll be promoted to higher paying jobs as their careers progress. But we should also note that there's sort of two types of contracts here. Right? There can be a formal contract or what's known as an implicit contract. Okay? Now, a formal contract is sort of an explicit agreement, right, between the employer and the employee, right? It's almost always written down, not always, but almost always, and signed, right? So if you have an employment contract, or if you have a boss or something like that right now, odds are that you signed a contract at some point, okay? And a copy, and you have a copy of it somewhere, right? And you can review it and see the terms of the contract and what you're obligated to do and what you're not obligated to do, etc., etc. And once the contract is signed and agreed to by both parties, right, it cannot be changed. So it cannot be changed once signed, right? So at some level, without penalty, you should say. Okay, so we cannot change the contract without incurring some sort of penalty. Okay, and so basically, a formal contract you can think of it as being sort of like the law between the two parties that have signed it. That contract is expressing the law, the promises and obligations that each one of them have made to each other. Okay. Now, there are also implicit contracts, right? And these, arise from the idea that a formal contract it will never be fully complete and won't cover literally every single possible circumstance, okay? So a formal contract might have explicit agreements, right? And it might have things that are in there that tell people, if you fail to do this thing, then this other thing happens, right? There might be contingencies or dispute resolution things, right, in a formal contract. But it's never going to be the case that every possible dispute will be anticipated and adjudicated within the contract. If it were, contracts would be absurdly long, which I know that if you've ever read, the iTunes end user agreement, right? It's a huge document, right? It covers lots of things. In fact, I think it even covers things like if you happen to use the iTunes software to make a bomb, right? It says that you are not, at the end of it, I think, it used to say this. It used to say that you are not allowed to use the iTunes software to make a bomb or other weapon for mass destruction, right? So if you found a way to make iTunes into a bomb, please don't tell me, right? And also don't do it because it's against the contract that you've signed, okay? And so even the Apple contract, which says don't use iTunes to make a bomb, right? Even that contract is still going to leave some circumstances that unanswered, right? Maybe, so you're not allowed to use iTunes to create a bomb, but maybe you're allowed to use it to create a gun, right? Who knows, right? Or maybe you're allowed to use iTunes to build a bread maker, right? I don't know how you would do it, but maybe there's a way. Maybe one of the lines of code would be really helpful in your bread maker, okay? And so as a result of this, right, contracts will never be fully complete and won't cover literally every single possible circumstance, right? And further, they'll almost always fail to fully spell out every single task down to the smallest minutia of what an employee is expected to do, right? And so some people, when I was washing boats way back in the day, the contract we would have our employees sign would say things that you have to wash the boat, right? And so one of our employees said, my contract says that I'm hired to wash boats. It doesn't say anywhere that I personally have to be clean and presentable, right? And so we had someone who would come into work and they wouldn't have showered that day. Maybe they hadn't shaved for a little while, right? They were wearing, old stained clothes from the night before, right? And they just didn't look clean or presentable. And when you are a cleaning company, right, you want to have clean employees. And so while the contract didn't say that they had to look good or they had to look presentable themselves, it seemed to be implied, right? One of my favorites came from my days working at a cigar shop, right? And so, one of the guys I used to work with, would say things like, well, no one told me that I had to refill the water in the humidifiers, right? So cigars, if you don't know, have to be kept at a certain humidity, otherwise they get ruined, okay? And so the guy said, nobody told me that I had to refill the water in the humidifiers, right? And so therefore it's not my fault that thousands of dollars of cigars have been ruined, okay? So suffice it to say that these things are somewhat obvious and easy to incorporate into a formal contract, which, we did for the boat washing company and the cigar shop. But think about the difficulties of spelling out exactly what it is that you do at your job down to the last detail. Your labor contract would either have to be so incredibly long as to be entirely unreadable, or it would have to be written in such a way that was vague enough to cover everything without really being clear, right? And so because of this, employment contracts are often simply incomplete, right? This doesn't cause too much of a problem, though, as there are often a set of informal understandings that are simply too vague to be legally enforceable. For example, if your labor contract says that you have to work hard, how exactly could you sort of prove, right, that you did this to your employer? And what exactly does it mean to work hard, right? Or what if your employer promises to promote deserving employees as opportunities arise, right? Again, what exactly does that mean? And how would we ever know if they didn't do that, okay? And so an implicit contract is sort of it's sort of the things or obligations not covered by the formal contract, but are still understood, nonetheless. Right? So showing up to work not hungover, right? I'm willing to bet that most of your contracts, if you guys have a job, almost none of your contracts say that you're not allowed to show up to work hungover, right? I know mine doesn't say that I can't do that, and yet I never come to work hungover, right? That would be implicit in the agreement to come work at somewhere, right? It would be implied that you guys shouldn't come to work hungover, right? Or you shouldn't come to work, high on some sort of drug, right? Or maybe the contract will say things like you must be courteous to the customers, right? Well, what does courteous mean? Well, it might mean no swearing at them, right? So you can't curse the customer out, but maybe there are some instances where you can, okay? And so all those conditions under which it's okay to swear at the customer, if they were to be formally written down, your contract would be huge, right? And so we sort of just say vague things like you must be courteous, right, to the customer. And then we know that the implication there is you don't curse at the customer unless it's actually warranted. And even then, you probably shouldn't do it, okay? And so in any type of contractual arrangement, there are formal things that are explicitly written down, but there are also implicit things that are often never written down, so these are never written down. So it's not that they're often not written down, it's they're never written down, right? They're never written down, but still understood. Okay, so we have formal arrangements and we have implicit arrangements. Okay, and understanding what your employer is going to put, in the formal aspect of the contract is a function of what they've experienced in the past, and also a function of what they explicitly need to make sure is done.